In New York City, money does not sleep, and neither do the things it leaves behind when its owner dies with unfinished desires. On the upper floors of a glass tower overlooking Central Park, where apartments sell for more than entire neighborhoods elsewhere, a man once lived who believed wealth could outlive love. His name was Leonard Hale, a billionaire whose signature moved markets, whose silence ended careers, and whose private life remained sealed behind security doors and non-disclosure agreements. Leonard Hale died years ago, alone in that same tower, surrounded by art he never looked at and views he no longer noticed. The city recorded his death as natural. The papers praised his legacy. The building kept its lights on. But something stayed behind, something that learned the sound of footsteps, the rhythm of heartbeats, and the difference between ambition and affection. Across the city, far below those upper floors, lived Ethan Moore and Clara Bennett, a young couple who still believed love could soften hard places. Ethan worked long hours for modest pay and told himself it was temporary. Clara carried dreams she rarely spoke aloud because dreaming felt dangerous when rent was due every month. They were not looking for luxury, power, or ghosts. They were looking for space, quiet, and a chance to begin without being watched. When an opportunity appeared that made no sense on paper, an apartment priced far below its value, located in a building reserved for people they were not supposed to become, they told each other it was luck. They told each other not to ask questions. Love does that sometimes. It convinces people that silence is safer than truth. What neither of them knew was that Leonard Hale had been waiting for years without time, observing without eyes, listening without ears. He had learned something in death that escaped him in life, that love leaves marks money never can. And when he felt it again, genuine and unguarded, moving through a space he still claimed as his own, it stirred what should have remained dormant. Because some ghosts do not linger out of regret alone. Some remain because they are drawn to what they were denied. And in a city built on desire, nothing burns brighter than two people choosing each other in a place where everything has a price. This is not a story about chance. It is not a story about fortune. It is a warning about what listens when love walks into rooms that once belonged to the dead. If stories like this pull you in, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. More dark, emotional stories like this are waiting for you here. And before we go any further, tell me something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments and let me know you are here. This is not a story about chance. It is not a story about fortune. It is a warning about what listens when love walks into rooms that once belonged to the dead. And once it notices you, it does not forget. New York at night does not truly go quiet. It only lowers its voice. Traffic thins but never disappears. Sirens travel in the distance, never close enough to matter, never far enough to ignore. Streetlights spill pale color onto empty sidewalks, reflecting off wet asphalt and glass storefronts that have already locked their doors. Above it all, the city rises in layers, steel and concrete stacked toward the clouds, each floor holding lives that rarely intersect. Luxury towers stand apart from the rest, their windows glowing softly like contained worlds. Some apartments are fully lit, alive with movement and sound. Others remain dark, untouched for months, preserved in a state of waiting. From the outside, it is impossible to tell which spaces are occupied and which are only pretending to be. Elevators move silently. Security desks remain staffed by men who have seen too much to ask questions. Everything looks controlled, measured, and expensive. Higher still, the city changes. The noise fades as the height increases. Traffic becomes a distant murmur. Human voices dissolve into nothing. From this elevation, New York feels less like a place full of people and more like a system that continues running whether anyone is paying attention or not. The higher floors offer privacy, but they also offer separation. Up here, loneliness has room to stretch. The building where Leonard Hale once lived rises among these towers, indistinguishable at a glance, yet heavier in presence. Its exterior is clean, polished, and deliberately unremarkable. Inside, the halls are wide, quiet, and kept at a temperature that never shifts. Cameras watch without blinking. Doors close softly. Nothing here feels accidental. From the street, there is no sign that anything is wrong. No broken windows, no flickering lights, but still, there is a sense of awareness that settles into the space after midnight, a feeling that something remains alert even as the city slows, not moving, not speaking, only observing. Ethan and Clara cannot feel it yet. They are still somewhere below, still surrounded by noise and motion, still unaware of how thin the distance is between being unseen and being noticed. Above them, the city holds its shape, the towers stand unmoving, and the night continues its slow descent. As the hours deepen, lights click off one by one, offices empty, apartments go dark. The city does what it always does. It exhales without stopping. And in that quiet, something remains awake. The city settles into darkness. Long before his name disappeared from headlines, Leonard Hale was spoken about in boardrooms with lowered voices and careful pauses. He was not loud, not theatrical, and not generous with attention. His power came from consistency, from an ability to wait longer than others and walk away without hesitation. People who worked for him described him as precise. People who competed against him described him as cold. Very few ever described him as happy. Leonard Hale built his fortune the way he lived his life, methodically and alone. He acquired companies not because he loved them, but because they fit into a pattern only he could see. Every decision followed a logic that left little room for impulse or affection. He believed that attachment weakened judgment, and he structured his world to avoid it. Relationships were temporary. Loyalty was contractual. Everything had a defined value. His apartment reflected that philosophy. It was vast, carefully designed, and almost untouched. Furniture was chosen for appearance rather than comfort. Art hung on the walls without explanation. The view of Central Park was framed perfectly, yet rarely enjoyed. People passed through his space, assistants, consultants, guests, but no one ever stayed long enough to leave an impression. The silence returned quickly after every departure. Those who knew fragments of his private life whispered about a woman he never named and a decision he never corrected. Some claimed she left him. Others said he pushed her away. No version of the story ended with reconciliation. Whatever love once existed in Leonard Hale's life was treated the same way he treated risk, acknowledged briefly, then removed before it could interfere. When he died, the event was efficient. There were no dramatic scenes, no public collapse, no drawn-out illness. One day he failed to appear for a meeting that would have shifted markets. By the next morning, his absence had been explained. Official statements were issued, condolences were delivered, stock prices adjusted. Life continued. What did not continue was his sense of completion. The details surrounding his death were never fully clarified, not because they were hidden, but because no one cared enough to look closely. A man with no family and no visible attachments leaves behind fewer questions than expected. His apartment was sealed, his possessions catalogued, his presence was reduced to paperwork. And yet, those who worked late in that building after his death noticed small things they could not explain. Elevators stopping on empty floors, lights turning on without reason, a feeling of pressure in certain rooms, as though someone was standing too close. These moments were dismissed, logged as technical issues, and forgotten. Leonard Hale had spent his life believing that control was permanence. In death, he learned something else entirely. Control had ended, but awareness had not. Something of him remained anchored to the space where he had defined himself. Not out of anger, but out of longing he never allowed himself to feel while alive. He did not rage, he did not roam, he waited. And waiting in a city like New York is never without purpose. Ethan Moore and Clara Bennett lived in a part of New York that did not make postcards. Their street was narrow, loud during the day, and restless at night. The walls of their apartment were thin enough to carry arguments from neighbors they never met. The radiator hissed without rhythm. The windows faced another building so close that daylight arrived late and left early. It was not a place meant for dreaming, yet they did it anyway. Ethan woke before sunrise most mornings, not because he enjoyed it, but because ambition had trained him to accept exhaustion as proof of effort. He worked a job that promised progress but delivered delay, each promotion always one evaluation away. Still, he believed in forward motion. He believed patience would be rewarded. When doubt crept in, he hid it behind reassurance and jokes that Clara had learned to see through. Clara carried her own weight quietly. She worked freelance contracts that paid just enough to justify hope, but never enough to remove fear. She kept lists of future plans that she rarely opened, afraid that looking too closely might make them feel fragile. What she lacked in certainty, she made up for in resilience. She believed in Ethan with a loyalty that felt instinctive rather than chosen. Their love lived in the small spaces between struggle, shared meals eaten too late, conversations whispered after midnight, moments of laughter that arrived without warning and left them breathless. They leaned on each other without discussing it, as though acknowledging that dependence might somehow weaken it. Together, they felt capable. Apart, the city felt heavier. The idea of moving came slowly, introduced first as a joke, then as a possibility, and finally as a necessity. Rent was increasing again. The apartment was shrinking in ways that had nothing to do with size. They wanted quiet. They wanted space. They wanted to believe that change did not always have to hurt. When Clara found the listing, she assumed it was a mistake. The price did not match the location. The photos showed wide rooms, clean lines, and windows that opened to the city instead of another wall. The building name carried weight, the kind associated with people they never expected to become. Ethan laughed when she showed him, then stopped when he saw the details. They checked it 3 times, then a 4th. There were no visible conditions, no catch explained, no waiting list, just an invitation to view. They told themselves it was timing. They told themselves the market was unpredictable. They told themselves that luck had finally noticed them. Neither of them mentioned the unease that settled quietly between those reassurances, the feeling that something about the opportunity felt too deliberate. That night, sitting on opposite ends of their worn couch, they made the decision without ceremony. They would see the apartment. They would ask questions later. They would not talk themselves out of hope before it had a chance to stand. Above them, in a building that never fully slept, something listened. And for the first time in years, it felt something stir. The day they went to see the apartment, New York felt unusually restrained, as though the city itself was holding its breath. The building rose above the street with a calm confidence that made Ethan slow his steps without realizing it. Clara noticed before he did. "Why did you stop?" she asked, turning back toward him. "I did not," Ethan replied, then glanced around and realized he had. He smiled, trying to soften the moment. "I just want to look at it first. That is all." Clara followed his gaze upward. The glass reflected the sky cleanly. No streaks, no imperfections. "It feels expensive," she said quietly. "Everything in this city feels expensive," Ethan said, though his voice lacked conviction. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polish and cold air. The floor reflected their shoes too clearly. A security desk sat unattended, its monitor glowing without sound. When the elevator doors opened, they did so without a chime, sliding apart smoothly, almost expectantly. Neither of them spoke as the elevator rose. The numbers climbed fast, too fast. Clara reached for Ethan's hand, not out of fear but habit. He squeezed back instinctively. "You still want this?" he asked. She nodded. "I want us," she said, "wherever that is." The apartment was larger than the photos suggested. The space felt open, quiet, and oddly untouched. Light poured in through tall windows, washing the room in a pale glow despite the overcast sky. The city stretched below them, distant and unreal. Clara stepped forward first, her footsteps soft against the floor. "It is beautiful," she said, almost whispering. Ethan followed, his eyes moving from corner to corner. "It does not feel lived in," he said. "It feels like it is waiting." They laughed at that, both of them dismissing the thought as nerves. Clara moved toward the windows and pressed her palm against the glass. It was cold, colder than she expected. "Imagine mornings here," she said. "Quiet ones." Ethan came up behind her, resting his chin lightly near her shoulder. "Imagine not hearing the neighbors argue at 2 a.m, he said. She turned to face him then, the city framed behind his head. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt full rather than empty. Clara reached up and adjusted his collar, a small familiar gesture that grounded her. "We could build something here," she said. "Not forever maybe, but enough." Ethan searched her face, reading what she was not saying. "If this scares you," he began. "It does," she said quickly. Then she smiled, But so did moving in together, so did staying when things got hard. He nodded slowly. Then we do it together. He leaned in and kissed her gently at first, then with a certainty that surprised them both. The room seemed to respond, the air shifting subtly, the quiet deepening. Somewhere behind them, faint and almost imperceptible, a sound echoed, like a distant breath against glass. Clara pulled back slightly. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Ethan frowned. "Hear what?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing, probably the building." As she said it, the light near the far wall flickered once, quickly, then steadied. Ethan noticed but chose not to comment. He had learned when to let moments pass. They stood there a little longer, holding each other, imagining a future that felt suddenly close enough to touch. Neither of them noticed the way the air felt heavier near the windows, or how the silence seemed attentive rather than empty. Later, as they left the apartment, Clara glanced back once more. She could not explain why, only that a sense of being observed brushed past her thoughts. She said nothing. By the time they reached the street, the feeling had faded, absorbed into traffic noise and passing voices. Ethan squeezed her hand again. "You see," he said, "just a place." Clara smiled and nodded, letting the city reclaim them. And far above, alone in the quiet he still claimed as his own, Leonard Hale listened and did not forget. Moving into the apartment felt unreal at first, like stepping into someone else's life and hoping no one noticed. Their furniture looked smaller in the wide rooms, their boxes temporary against the clean walls, but neither of them complained. Each day felt like proof that they belonged somewhere they once only imagined. Mornings became slower. Light reached them earlier through the tall windows, soft and pale, stretching across the floor, before either of them stirred. Clara started waking before Ethan, standing by the glass with a mug in her hands, watching the city arrange itself below. When Ethan joined her, still half asleep, he would rest his forehead against her shoulder without speaking. "I could get used to this," he said one morning. Clara smiled. "You already are." Evenings were quieter than they expected. The city noise barely reached them, reduced to a distant hum that felt comforting rather than intrusive. They cooked together more often, experimenting with meals they could not afford before, simply because the kitchen made it feel possible. They ate slowly, talking about plans they had once avoided. "I want a place where time does not feel borrowed," Clara said one night, her legs folded beneath her on the couch. Ethan nodded. "I want to stop feeling like I am catching up to my own life." They spoke about travel, about work that mattered, about a future that felt less abstract now that space surrounded them. The apartment seemed to hold their voices gently, never echoing, never interrupting. Small things began to happen during those early weeks. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. A door left ajar when they were certain they had closed it. The sound of movement in another room that stopped when they listened. Lights dimming briefly, then returning to normal. Ethan blamed the building. Clara blamed her nerves. "You are not used to quiet," Ethan told her when she mentioned it. "Your mind fills it in." She accepted that explanation because it felt reasonable, and because being wrong felt easier than being afraid. At night, they slept deeply. Too deeply. Clara sometimes woke with the sensation that time had passed differently than it should have, as though hours had been rearranged while she rested. Once, she thought she heard someone speaking her name, low and distant. But when she turned toward Ethan, he was asleep, his breathing slow and steady. During the day, the apartment felt welcoming. During the night, it felt attentive. Leonard Hale did not intrude. He observed. He lingered near the edges of their routines, drawn to the way they moved together without calculation. He noticed how Ethan waited for Clara to finish speaking, how Clara reached for Ethan's hand without looking. These were gestures Leonard had once dismissed as inefficient, now studied with quiet fascination. The disturbances remained subtle, never enough to demand confrontation, always just enough to be noticed and dismissed. A reflection in the glass that lingered a second too long, a chill that passed through a room without explanation, a sense fleeting but persistent that something shared the space with them. Yet the longer they stayed, the more secure they felt. Love filled the rooms faster than doubt ever could. They unpacked the last box. They hung photos. They made plans that extended months ahead without hesitation. "This feels safe," Clara said one evening, her head resting against Ethan's chest. "It is," he replied, believing it completely. Above them, around them, within the quiet they trusted, something listened with patience, not hunger, not anger, curiosity. And comfort, when it settles too easily, has a way of hiding what waits beneath it. The first undeniable moment came without drama, without warning, and without the kind of spectacle people expect when fear announces itself. It arrived quietly, on a night that had begun like many others, calm, familiar, and unremarkable. Ethan was in the kitchen rinsing a glass when he felt it, a sudden pressure in the room, as though the air had thickened around him. The sound of running water seemed distant, muted, like it was coming from somewhere else. He turned slightly, about to call out to Clara, when the lights above him dimmed and then went out completely. "Clara," he said, not raising his voice, "did you touch the switch?" There was no answer. From the living room came a low sound, not a voice, not a breath, but something in between, a subtle vibration that made the floor beneath his feet feel unfamiliar. The lights flickered back on, one by one, slower than before. Ethan stepped into the living room and stopped. Clara was standing near the windows, completely still, her arms hanging at her sides. The glass in front of her was no longer reflecting the city behind them. Instead, it reflected the room, and within that reflection stood a third figure. It was not solid, it did not cast a shadow, but it was unmistakably there, tall, still watching. "Clara," Ethan said again, this time sharper. She did not turn. Her voice came out strained, as though it had traveled a long distance to reach him. "Do you see him?" Ethan swallowed. "I see something," he said carefully. "Do not move." The figure in the glass shifted slightly, its outline sharpening just enough to suggest form without detail. The sensation in the room changed, no longer passive, no longer curious. It felt deliberate. Leonard Hale was aware of them. The temperature dropped, not suddenly but gradually, as if the room was adjusting itself around his presence. The lights dimmed again, stopping just short of darkness. The reflection tilted its head, an old habit, one Leonard had carried even into death. Clara turned then, finally pulling her eyes away from the glass. "It is not angry," she said, her voice trembling despite her words. "It feels like it is looking at us." Ethan shook his head. "No," he said, "this is not real. We are tired, that is all." The reflection smiled. It was brief, subtle, and unmistakable. Clara gasped and stumbled backward into Ethan's arms. The moment her body left the window, the figure vanished. The glass returned to normal. City lights blinked calmly below them. The room released its pressure as if nothing had happened. Silence followed. Heavy. Absolute. Ethan held Clara tightly, his heart racing in a way he did not want to acknowledge. "You saw it too," she whispered. "I saw something," he replied, forcing steadiness into his voice. "Reflections do strange things at night. Buildings settle, our minds fill gaps." She pulled back slightly, searching his face. "It looked at me like it knew me." He exhaled slowly. "We are going to sleep," he said. "Tomorrow we laugh about this." Clara nodded, though her hands were still shaking. "Yes," she said, not because she agreed, but because she needed to believe him. They turned off the lights and went to bed, neither of them noticing the faint imprint left on the glass, visible only from certain angles. And in the quiet that followed, Leonard Hale remained fully awake, no longer content to simply observe. Part 7. Morning arrived on schedule, bright and ordinary, and that alone felt like reassurance. Sunlight filled the apartment with confidence, stripping the night of its weight and reducing what had happened to something distant and poorly defined. Ethan leaned into that normalcy immediately, moving through the kitchen with deliberate calm, brewing coffee, opening the windows, letting the city announce itself below. "See," he said, handing Clara a mug. "Everything looks fine." Clara accepted it, wrapping her hands around the warmth, though her eyes lingered on the glass longer than necessary. "It felt real," she said quietly. "So do dreams," Ethan replied, "especially the ones that wake you up." They did not argue. Instead, they agreed to stop naming it. That decision brought a strange closeness, a shared silence that made them feel united against something undefined. They stayed near each other that day, working from home, touching often, grounding themselves in presence. Their affection deepened under the pressure. Ethan became more attentive, more protective. Clara leaned into him with an intensity that surprised even her. They spoke about the future with renewed urgency, as though naming plans might anchor them. Leonard Hale watched with growing interest. He recognized their fear, but what fascinated him was what came after. He had known hesitation. He had known caution. What he had never known was this kind of devotion born from vulnerability. Their closeness stirred something in him that memory alone could not satisfy. The disturbances returned, stronger this time, but still controlled. Objects shifted subtly when unobserved. Music played faintly from speakers that had been turned off. The apartment developed patterns that did not belong to them. Clara began waking at exactly the same time every night, always feeling as though someone had just left the room. "You are losing sleep," Ethan said one evening. "We both are." "We could move," she offered, though the suggestion lacked conviction. Ethan shook his head. "We are not running from shadows." Leonard drew closer, not violently, not suddenly. His presence became more confident, more deliberate. Mirrors held reflections a moment too long. The air changed when Clara stood alone. Ethan began to feel watched even when nothing was visible, an awareness that followed him through rooms. The contrast between them grew clearer. The couple moved forward, fueled by hope and immediacy. Leonard remained anchored to regret, bound to a life defined by control and restraint. Their youth radiated something he had never allowed himself to experience fully, and the pull of it grew harder to resist. One evening, as they prepared for bed, Clara stopped near the window, her reflection overlapping with the city behind her. A chill brushed her spine. "We should leave," she said suddenly. Ethan turned to her. "Why now?" Before she could answer, the lights dimmed again, not flickering this time, but lowering smoothly, intentionally. A voice followed, not loud, not threatening, but unmistakably present. "Do not," it said. The word lingered in the air, soft but firm. Ethan felt it then, the certainty that whatever shared their space was no longer content to remain silent. He opened his mouth to speak, to confront it, to demand reason, but the lights returned to normal, and the room released its tension. Silence reclaimed the apartment. Clara stared at him, her fear unmasked. "It warned us," she whispered. Ethan forced a breath and shook his head. "No," he said, "we are not doing this. We are not letting this become real." He kissed her forehead, a gesture meant to reassure, meant to end the conversation. Clara nodded slowly, swallowing the words she wanted to say. Above them, around them, Leonard Hale listened, his patience thinning, his interest sharpening, and the warning they chose to ignore settled deeper into the walls. The realization did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, layered across days that felt increasingly misaligned with time. The apartment no longer behaved like a neutral space. It responded. Sounds followed patterns, lights dimmed with intention. Silence arrived exactly when it was least welcome. Clara was the first to stop pretending it was random. She began noticing how the disturbances aligned with moments of closeness. When she and Ethan laughed too freely, the air cooled. When they argued softly and reconciled minutes later, the room felt heavier, attentive. When they held each other for long stretches without speaking, something shifted, subtle but unmistakable, as if their presence was being measured. One afternoon, while Ethan was out, Clara stood alone in the living room and said quietly, "What do you want?" She did not expect an answer. She only needed to hear the words leave her mouth. The response came anyway, not as a voice this time, but as memory forced into form. The room darkened slowly, not fully, just enough to blur the edges. The windows reflected something other than the city, a scene layered beneath the glass like a second life. Clara saw it clearly. A man standing alone in the same room decades earlier, younger, sharper, dressed in tailored stillness. Leonard Hale, alive yet already hollow. She saw him watching another reflection, not his own, but that of a woman standing where Clara now stood. The woman's face was indistinct, but her posture was familiar, hopeful, open. Leonard did not touch her. He did not move closer. He hesitated. The image dissolved, replaced by another. Leonard alone again, older, seated at a long table meant for many, eating in silence. Another shift. The woman gone. Another shift. The same apartment, sealed, untouched, waiting. Clara staggered back, breath shallow. "You lost her," she whispered. The temperature steadied, the pressure eased slightly. The response felt almost like agreement. That evening, Clara told Ethan everything. She did not soften it. She did not leave out details. She spoke until her voice shook and then kept going. "He is not angry," she said. "He is watching us because he remembers what he never chose." Ethan listened, tension tightening his jaw. "You are saying this thing is attached to us?" "Yes," Clara replied, "because we are doing what he did not." Leonard Hale had not stayed because he feared death. He stayed because he feared regret, and regret had found shape in the presence of love that still dared to exist where his own had failed. The haunting was not random. It was drawn, deliberate, sustained by comparison. Their intimacy was not a threat. It was a mirror. Leonard's awareness sharpened as their understanding grew. Objects no longer moved subtly. Doors opened fully. Reflections lingered long enough to meet their eyes. He did not hide anymore. One night, the apartment filled with a pressure that forced Ethan to sit down, breath unsteady. The lights dimmed and held. "You live where I ended," the voice said, clearer now, closer. "You choose what I delayed." Clara stood beside Ethan, fear present but no longer paralyzing. "You could have chosen her," she said. "You chose control instead." Silence followed, heavy and deliberate. Leonard's presence filled the room, not violent, but absolute. His form sharpened, visible now without reflection, standing just beyond reach. His expression held no rage, only longing stretched thin by time. "I waited," he said. "I calculated, I postponed, and then there was no one left to return to." Ethan understood then. This was not about possession. It was about proximity. Leonard did not want their love destroyed. He wanted it close, constant, undeniable. He wanted to feel it again, even if only as an observer. "That is why you warned us," Clara said softly. "You want us here, together." The apartment responded, a low vibration passing through the walls. The truth settled between them, heavy and unavoidable. Their presence fed the haunting. Their love anchored it. Leaving might weaken it, but staying would deepen its hold. As they stood there, understanding finally complete, Ethan reached for Clara's hand. She did not pull away. The realization was clear now. This was no longer about fear. It was about choice. After the realization, nothing returned to normal, not even briefly. Understanding did not bring relief. It sharpened everything. The apartment no longer felt like a place they occupied, but a space that reacted to them, adjusted itself around their movements, their moods, their silences. They tried to leave at first, not permanently, just enough to breathe. A night at a friend's place, a weekend away. Every attempt collapsed under small, unexplainable resistance. Taxi apps failed to load. Elevators stalled between floors. Doors hesitated before opening, just long enough to plant doubt. None of it was violent. All of it was precise. "You feel that too," Ethan said one morning as they stood in the hallway, coats on, keys in hand. Clara nodded. "It is like the building knows when we are about to go." Leonard Hale did not speak during those moments. He did not need to. His influence had matured into something more controlled, more intimate. He understood boundaries now and how close he could press without forcing them to break. Isolation followed naturally. Friends stopped visiting, offering excuses that sounded rehearsed even to themselves. Phones dropped calls when conversations turned toward the apartment. Messages failed to send. The world beyond their walls felt increasingly distant, like a place they remembered rather than inhabited. Fear settled unevenly between them. Ethan carried it outward, becoming restless, irritable, pacing the rooms late into the night. Clara carried hers inward, growing quieter, more observant, listening for shifts in the air, for patterns that only she seemed able to detect. They argued more often, their voices low but sharp, about leaving, about staying, about whether love was enough to withstand what was pressing in on them. "You are talking like this is a test," Ethan said once, frustration breaking through. "Like if we just endure it, it means something." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "Maybe it does." Leonard watched these moments with painful familiarity. He recognized the way fear twisted affection into defensiveness. He remembered the way silence grew heavier when words went unsaid. Their tension mirrored his own past with unsettling accuracy. The haunting intensified in response. Night stretched unnaturally. Hours passed without movement. When sleep came, it brought dreams that did not feel like their own. Ethan dreamed of standing in boardrooms he had never entered, watching deals collapse because he hesitated. Clara dreamed of waiting in rooms that never filled, her reflection aging while time stood still. They began to wake with those emotions clinging to them, residue from a life not lived. The apartment grew colder, not in temperature, but in tone. Spaces that once felt open now felt compressed. The windows reflected more than they should. Sometimes Leonard stood openly at the edge of their vision, his presence solid enough to register, distant enough to remain unreachable. He did not threaten, he did not beg, he observed their endurance. Love, under that pressure, did not disappear. It changed shape. It became quieter, more deliberate. Touch carried weight. Every shared glance felt earned. They held each other longer, as though physical contact could anchor them against something pulling inward. "I am still here," Clara whispered one night, her forehead pressed to Ethan's chest. "So am I," he replied, though his voice carried doubt he could no longer hide. Leonard felt that doubt like a fracture. It resonated with his own history, with the moment he had chosen distance over risk. Watching them struggle without withdrawing stirred something in him that bordered on desperation. The apartment responded accordingly. Walls creaked with memory, the air pressed closer, the sense of being watched sharpened into certainty. There was no safe corner left, no moment untouched, no hour free from awareness. And through it all, Leonard Hale remained, his presence heavy with regret, his influence tightening, not to destroy them, but to hold them close to what he had lost. There was no relief. By the time the choice revealed itself, both of them already sensed it. The apartment had shifted again, not in temperature or light, but in intention. The pressure no longer felt curious or observant. It felt urgent. Leonard Hale was running out of patience, not because he wanted harm, but because desire left unattended had begun to curdle into need. The night it became clear, rain pressed steadily against the windows, blurring the city into streaks of color and motion. Ethan sat at the dining table, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the surface, as if answers might rise from it. Clara stood near the bedroom doorway, arms folded tightly around herself, watching him breathe. "He is afraid," she said quietly. Ethan looked up. "You are talking about him like he is still alive." "In some ways," Clara replied, "he is more present than we are." The lights dimmed slightly, not as a warning, but as acknowledgement. The air thickened, carrying a familiar weight that no longer startled them. Leonard's presence gathered in the center of the room, subtle at first, then unmistakable. His outline formed slowly, as though the space itself was conceding to him. "You understand now," Leonard said. His voice was steadier than before, but strained at the edges. "Love does not survive delay." Clara stepped forward before Ethan could stop her. "You want one of us," she said, "not both." Leonard did not answer immediately, silence stretched, heavy with implication. "I want what endures," he said at last. The meaning settled painfully between them. The haunting had anchored itself to their bond, but bonds could be altered, reshaped, diminished. Separation would weaken him, sacrifice would sustain him. Leonard did not want their destruction. He wanted permanence, even if it meant claiming a piece of what made them whole. Ethan stood abruptly. "No," he said, "you do not get to decide that." Leonard turned toward him slowly. "I already did once," he replied, "and it ended me." The apartment reacted to his admission. Walls creaked softly. The rain outside intensified. The sense of containment closed in, not violently but firmly. Clara's voice broke the tension. "If we leave together," she said, "you lose us." "Yes," Leonard replied, "and I fade." "And if one of us stays," Ethan said, his voice tight, "you remain." Leonard did not deny it. The pacing of the world seemed to slow then, as though time itself had leaned in to listen. Every movement felt deliberate, every breath carried weight. Love, stripped of comfort, stood exposed in its rawest form. Clara moved closer to Ethan, resting her hand against his chest, feeling the familiar rhythm beneath. "I will not let him take you," she said. Ethan covered her hand with his own. "I will not let him trap you." Leonard watched them with an intensity that bordered on anguish. This moment, this refusal to withdraw, this insistence on choosing each other despite cost, it was everything he had avoided in life and everything he craved now. "You think sacrifice is loss," Leonard said softly. "Sometimes it is preservation." Clara shook her head. "Not like this." The pressure surged, not outward, but inward, focusing, compressing. The apartment seemed smaller, closer, as though walls had leaned toward the center. Leonard's desperation bled through his restraint. "If you stay," he said, his voice low, "I will keep him safe." Ethan laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You do not get to bargain with love." Silence followed, long, tense. Then Clara exhaled slowly and looked at Ethan with a clarity that frightened him more than anything else had. "We cannot let this continue," she said. "Not like this." He searched her face. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," she replied, "that love sometimes means choosing the pain you can live with." Leonard's presence sharpened, drawn forward by the gravity of the moment. The apartment held its breath. Ethan shook his head. "No, we find another way." Clara smiled sadly. "We already did." She squeezed his hand once, grounding him, steadying herself. "Whatever happens," she said, "we choose it together." Ethan's eyes filled, but he nodded. Together. Above them, within them, around them, Leonard Hale felt something fracture and something else ignite. The waiting was over, the choice had been made, and they committed to act. The moment they committed, the apartment responded as if it had been waiting for permission. The lights dimmed completely, not into darkness, but into a gray stillness where edges softened and depth collapsed. The city beyond the windows vanished, replaced by a flat reflection that showed only the room and what stood within it. Leonard Hale no longer lingered at the margins. He stood fully formed now, no distortion left in his shape. Dressed as he must have been on the night everything ended. His presence carried weight, not physical but emotional, the accumulated gravity of a life spent controlling outcomes and avoiding vulnerability. The air bent toward him, attentive. "This is where it ends," Leonard said, his voice steady but threaded with something raw. "One choice, one stays, one goes. That is how permanence works." Ethan stepped forward before Clara could speak, placing himself between her and Leonard without hesitation. His fear was no longer frantic. It had settled into something colder, sharper. "You are wrong," Ethan said. "Permanence is not ownership." Leonard's gaze shifted to him. "You speak like someone who has not lost everything." Ethan swallowed. "You never lost it, you walked away." The words struck harder than anything else had. Leonard's expression faltered, not in anger, but in recognition. The room reacted instantly. The walls trembled, not violently, but as if memory itself had been disturbed. Clara felt it then, the full truth rising around her, no longer fragmented. Leonard had not been abandoned. He had been chosen, again and again, and he had refused to believe it until the choice expired. His death had not been sudden. It had been quiet, deliberate, the final extension of delay. "You waited too long," Clara said softly, stepping beside Ethan. "And now you want time to stop for us because it stopped for you." Leonard's form flickered, just slightly. "I want to feel it again," he said. "What you have, what I denied." "You cannot borrow love," Ethan replied. "It only works when it is given." The pressure in the room peaked. Leonard's desperation surged, no longer controlled, no longer patient. Objects lifted from surfaces, hovering briefly before settling back down. The apartment groaned, stretched thin between past and present. "If one of you stays," Leonard said, his voice cracking for the first time, "it will anchor me. I will let the other go." Clara closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them with resolve. She turned to Ethan, her hand trembling as she pressed it against his chest. "You have to leave," she said quietly. Ethan stared at her. "No, you have to," she repeated. "He is tied to regret. I am tied to choice." Leonard froze. "That is not how this works." Clara looked past Ethan, directly at Leonard. "You do not want sacrifice," she said. "You want absolution." She stepped forward, not toward Leonard, but into the center of the room, placing herself fully within the weight of his presence. The air tightened around her, responding instantly. Ethan reached for her, panic breaking through. "Clara, stop!" She turned back to him, smiling through fear. "I am not staying for him," she said. "I am choosing you." Leonard recoiled slightly, confused. "That makes no sense." "It does," Clara replied. "You are bound to love withheld. I am bound to love given freely. You cannot hold both." She closed her eyes and spoke the words Leonard had never allowed himself to say while alive. She spoke forgiveness, not for him alone, but for the version of himself he had abandoned. The apartment shuddered as if struck by a wave. Leonard cried out, not in pain, but in release. The pressure broke. Light surged through the room, not blinding, but warm, reclaiming space that had been compressed by memory and regret. Leonard's form began to dissolve, not violently but gently, unraveling as the bond that sustained him weakened. Ethan felt the shift immediately. The air cleared. The weight lifted. He rushed to Clara, pulling her into his arms as Leonard faded, his expression no longer desperate, but relieved. "I waited," Leonard whispered, his voice thinning. "You did not," and then he was gone. The apartment fell silent, truly silent, for the first time since they arrived. No pressure, no awareness, no presence lingering just beyond sight. Ethan held Clara tightly, his breath uneven. "You scared me," he said. She pressed her forehead to his. "Love is supposed to." Around them, the space felt empty, but not hollow, changed, but no longer watching. Love had not ended the haunting by force. It had ended it by refusing to repeat it. The silence that followed was not immediate. It arrived slowly, settling into the apartment like dust after a collapse. The lights stabilized, the air warmed, the windows reflected only what stood before them. Ethan and Clara remained where they were, holding each other, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. Minutes passed without interruption. No pressure returned. No sound followed them from room to room. The apartment felt empty in a way it never had before. Not abandoned, but released. Whatever had been listening was no longer present. They sat on the floor together, backs against the couch, exhaustion overtaking fear. Ethan traced circles on Clara's hand without realizing it. Clara rested her head against his shoulder, eyes closed, breathing steady. "It is over," Ethan said quietly. "Yes," Clara replied, but not unchanged. They had gained freedom, but it came with residue. Sleep did not come easily that night. When it did, it was shallow, interrupted by moments of waking uncertainty. They no longer felt watched, yet awareness lingered, like a habit the mind had not released. By morning, the apartment looked the same, clean, bright, expensive, but something intangible had been removed. The space felt larger, less focused, as though it no longer revolved around a single point of memory. They spoke less about what had happened, and more about what came next. Leaving felt necessary now, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Some places hold too much history to be lived in lightly. As they packed, Clara paused near the window where it had all begun. For a brief moment she thought she saw something in the glass, not a figure, not a face, just a distortion that did not belong. Then it was gone. They left the apartment together, hand in hand, carrying more than they arrived with and less than they feared they would lose. Later, long after the door closed behind them, the building returned to its routine. Elevators moved, lights turned on and off. The city continued without pause. But on the highest floor, in the quiet hours before dawn, one window caught the light differently than the others. For just a moment, it reflected a man standing alone, watching the city he no longer owned. Then the reflection shifted, and the glass went dark. You see, New York has a way of convincing people that more is always better. More money, more space, more control. Towers rise, fortunes change hands, and names fade from memory faster than they are carved into stone. What remains is not what was owned, but what was chosen. Leonard Hale believed wealth could protect him from loss. He believed distance was safer than devotion. In the end, he discovered what the city never teaches willingly, that emptiness grows fastest in rooms where love is delayed. His silence was expensive. His regret cost everything. Ethan and Clara left with less certainty than they wanted, but more truth than they expected. Love did not make them powerful. It made them vulnerable. And that vulnerability, fragile and unguarded, was the one thing the ghost could not survive. Some places remember who we were. Some places remember what we refused to become. And some nights, when the city grows quiet and the lights thin out one by one, you might feel a presence in rooms built too high and lived in too little, not watching, just remembering.